Advocata's Reform Now conference, let's reset Sri Lanka, is happening now, Ravi. And one of the main components of this program is the launch of a report on state-owned enterprises. So can you tell us a little bit about why the discussion on state-owned enterprises is important at this juncture?
Right. So if we try to just backtrack to the roots of where this crisis starts, it's due to the mismanagement of public finances. The government has been spending far more than what it actually earns. And this deficit, they financed historically for many decades now with debt. The debt itself, they never repay in full. They keep getting fresh debt to repay it, and fresh debt to repay the interest. So the debt keeps snowballing. So now you've got a situation where in 2020 or 2021, interest made up 71% of your government revenue. So you've got a public debt problem. The other problem that we've had in the last 2 or 3 years is the deficit has also been financed through money printing or money creation. We've done it in the past from time to time. We've always seen the currency depreciate. Here we did it on a scale that we've never tried before. So you printed money, pressure on the currency, tried to hold the currency, eroded all your reserves, and then when the currency finally collapses, you get this shock to the economy where the entire price structure within the economy has to readjust from 200 to 350 or 360 or wherever the currency finally settles. So that's the huge dislocating shock that hits the economy, and then people can't afford what they were buying the previous week. The companies can't afford to produce, consumers can't consume. So that's that shock that comes from trying to hold a currency. Plus you've got that debt problem. But the whole thing starts because the money printing and the debt is how you finance a deficit, right? So it's your government deficit that you need to focus on. So government spending, both capital and recurrent, are part of your problem. Now there's a common theme that seems to recur amongst the protesters, amongst everybody, that corruption is the sole problem. Now at a philosophical level, yes, it's true, because what has happened is corruption has resulted in perverted decisions and policy. The policy making process, you can call it, it's not really a policy making, it's just decisions. But the whole process has become corrupted and driven by various short-term imperatives. So in that sense, corruption is a problem. But what has happened is, thanks to certain decisions taken in the past, you have recurrent ongoing spending commitments that are going to continue into the future. So you have the debt and the interest which you have to continue paying. Okay, you've defaulted on the foreign debt, but at some point you will have to start paying it in some. So the debt and the interest are going to, you'll have to keep paying that maybe at a lower rate. You've also got the public sector workforce. It was 800,000 more or less in about 2004. You've increased that to 1.5 or 6 million. You've got to pay their pensions and their salaries, which now takes up about 86% of your government revenue. So you've got an interest bill that's not going to go away, which takes up 71% of your government revenue. You've got pensions and salaries, which take up 86% of your government revenue. Even if your corruption stops full stop today, these spending commitments are still in place. So if you want to address this, you need to start looking at fixing the problems in your spending. Right now, if your biggest items of spending are interest, you are trying to restructure your debt, and pensions and salaries, there's no way out than to start looking at how you can downsize the public sector workforce. But this is a very difficult decision because how do you get rid of 500,000 or 600,000 people? You can't do it in the short term, right? And especially when the government has monopolies in certain critical areas, in the port, in the energy sector, in the electricity in petroleum. These are formerly, the petroleum used to be a competitive multiplayer industry in the 1950s. Before the creation of the Petroleum Corporation. Now you've got one monopoly player. A strike there cripples the country. The same with the port. Port strikes were used in the 50s and 60s were common, and the whole economy grinds to a halt. So so those areas, the interest is difficult to adjust. The pension salary, you can do it over time perhaps. So that leaves you with not many options but to reform your SOEs. Right, so the SOE losses contribute to the budget deficit. The SOE debt, which is sometimes which adds to the government burden. So, which is why amongst the list of options that you have to consider, SOEs become one of the things where you can maybe make some headway a bit faster than some of the other areas.
So, given Sri Lanka's crisis situation, we are really in a place where we can't afford to delay these reforms as well. So, Advocata has launched a report which covers the history of state-owned enterprises in Sri Lanka, how they came about, the rationale for their existence. And we also talk a lot about the issues which you just discussed, which is some of the causes of SOE underperformance. Yeah. So one of the and of course debt related to the state-owned enterprises. One of the main components of this report is a new scorecard methodology, which aims to assess the performance, both the financial and non-financial performance of these state-owned enterprises in the country. So can you tell us a little bit about how do we measure the performance of state-owned enterprises in Sri Lanka?
Yes, so the biggest problem with the SOEs is the lack of information. So we've had to restrict this yet again to the 52 strategic SOEs in which there is some degree of level of information available. There's possibly 100 plus commercial SOEs plus many other entities that the government calls SOEs, but which may not be actually commercial entities. But there's a limited amount of information that's available. So if you try to assess performance, it's rather difficult. So what the report does is they've looked at a measure of return on assets to measure performance, while there may be other measures that are useful for certain industries. It's probably the broadest measure that captures all the fundamentals of business performance in a holistic way. So the return on assets is the measure, and the data is available. Is a simple way of trying to assess how well your SOEs have performed. Now, the government does not set a benchmark for what it hopes to achieve in terms of financial returns from the SOE. So the report uses the effective cost of debt, the average cost of the government borrowing, the interest, which works out about 7.5% average for between 2015 to 19, which is the rate that is used. So the report tries to compare the return on assets with the cost of government borrowing. The rationale is that the government activity will always displace some private activity. It may be private consumption, or it may displace private investment. So we would expect, look at purely from a financial perspective, that your assets would earn a return in excess of your cost of borrowing. So of the 52, about half of them don't actually earn a positive return, okay. And only about 8 of them earn returns over the target of 7.5%, which is the government cost of borrowing. They've also done some comparisons with some selected private sector organizations, for example, in the banks and the financial sector, and also some regional comparisons as well. Now, these are not perfect comparisons. they may not be comparable in size, but certainly the banks, the local private banks are much smaller. They lack the scale of the state banks. They lack some of the advantages the state banks have. But that's also provided just to get people talking about these enterprises, because now the banking and financial sector is one of the sectors that is actually very profitable in absolute terms. But if you look at return on assets within the government sector, it's about 1%. But if you compare it with some of the larger private banks, they earn returns on assets of about 1.3 or 1.4%. So the private banks seem to be earning about 30 or 40% greater return on assets than the government bank. Now, it's so these are simply some figures that we've put together that will draw people's attention and get them to ask some very fundamental questions about what SOEs, how they are performing, and to get people to look more closely at this, and perhaps for the government to start releasing better information so that more detailed comparisons can be done. I think there are many think tanks and other individuals who would probably be quite interested in digging into some of the depths of some of these figures if all the relevant figures were consistently available. So the report does a scorecard of financial performance. They've also got a scorecard of some governance indicators, which they've tried to rank and again to highlight some of the issues in the governance structure.
Okay. So Sri Lanka has about, as far as we know, about 527 state-owned enterprises, and sometimes it's difficult to even be sure whether it's actually 527 or it could even be more. So there is a lack of transparency sometimes from the side of the state-owned enterprises. I think the report highlights the methodology of the report. Like if you go through, you can find out more about it. Highlights the difficulties in obtaining some of the financial and the non-financial information to even do this assessment, which is why Advocata has done this for the strategic SOEs, which usually have better information. So would you say, based on the overall scorecard, would you say that the performance has been below satisfaction for Sri Lanka's SOEs?
They don't. If you look purely at the financial return, it's not really very impressive. But this is just a fairly simple comparison. I think the bigger question that we'd like people to ask is some fairly fundamental question. First of all, that the fact that the start of accountability, which is what the political process is all about. Accountability starts with information. If the public does not know what is going on, you can't ask hard questions about the SOEs. So which is also why the government and the government organizations deliberately withhold information. So they sent many an RTI request for information. Only a few got acknowledged and a few answered. They don't publish their annual reports on time. There's so many gaps. You can't hold something to account if you don't have the information. That's the first hurdle. So the report highlights some of those. The second is, I think the bigger question that we need to ask is, how does government involvement in these SOEs improve public welfare? Right now, if you look at the state banks, which make large absolute profits, right? Regardless of the question as to whether they've provided adequately for debts from other state-owned enterprises which have borrowed on government guarantees, which they may not be providing for, which may not be performing in terms of repayment, but which thanks to the guarantee from the treasury they may not be providing for. So you might need to question as to whether those results are and whether the provisioning is adequate, and therefore whether the results are are reasonable. But if you just go back to the involvement in the banking sector, at independence, Sri Lanka had a few foreign banks, a couple of local banks. The average Sri Lankan citizens couldn't ever hope to get a loan from a bank. They opening a bank account was also difficult. So it made sense in the 1960s and 50s for the to take over the Bank of Ceylon, to set up the People's Bank, to set up the National Savings Bank, to promote financial inclusion, to bring people, to give people access to banks, so that they didn't have to store their money in mattresses, to promote savings, and to transact business. But today, thanks to a lot of liberalization that has gone on, people have access to bank accounts, loans are available, perhaps too freely so in some of these microcredit institutions, which need to be very strictly regulated and controlled. That's a different question. But does the government really need to run state banks anymore? Right? They are highly profitable. If they are listed, they could do a lot to help develop the capital market. There'll be greater transparency, and the government could also raise revenue. So, is there a point in the government getting involved in state banks anymore? Similarly with the petroleum corporation, this was they took over Shell, Esso, and Caltex, who were distributing fuel in the early 1961, I think it was. Then initially the petroleum corporation was set up as a competitor. Then they took over the foreign businesses to control the commanding heights of the economy. Then in 1969, somebody thought that they could earn good revenue for the government if they operated a refinery. So if you look at where that particular forecast has gone, it's become the biggest burden on the government treasury, you see. And okay, now you're seeing fuel shortages thanks to the fact that you've got LIOC. There's some supply of fuel that can perhaps come despite the government finances being in a mess. But even then it's difficult for them because they also have to struggle with this problem of exchange. But is there really a role for the government in petroleum? Is there some? So you need to ask, because you've got yourself into a crisis which
Yes.
is going to be long drawn out. You can't solve your debt. You'll be able to get some postponement in payments, but it's going to persist in the medium term. You can't reduce the public sector payroll overnight. You can freeze the salaries and increments. You can freeze the recruitment, and you can hope gradually to through attrition to reduce the workforce somewhat. Then you can perhaps do some compulsory retirement schemes with compensation. But it's going to be a slow process. So when you've got hard options, you need to question what is your involvement in SOEs, and is it really improving public welfare? If there is a strong case for that, then it can continue. But otherwise, do you really need to be involved in this?
So we invite everybody to check out the newly launched website soe.lk, where you can explore some of the reports as well as the scorecard, and find out more details about what's really going on with Sri Lanka state-owned enterprises. So Ravi, any final thoughts on the future, maybe the reforms and maybe the future of state-owned enterprises in Sri Lanka?
Yes, if we look at now, one of the reforms that a lot of people have been talking about is there is the so-called Temasek model, which is about a centralized holding company. The report goes into some of that as well. Now, the problem really with the state enterprises is you've got the reason for the underperformance, which the figures is the first is the conflicting objectives, right? they have to they are supposed to turn a profit, right? But at the same, which is why they're not government departments. But but at the same time, they need to provide jobs to government supporters. They need to buy supplies from government sources or contractors. They need to locate their plants and factories in particular locations based on political considerations rather than commercial considerations. And there are so many. They need to provide subsidies to certain quarters. It doesn't have a simple commercial objective like in the private. So these conflicting objectives it makes it rather difficult to perform. So the general prescription is that you should not be using state enterprises to provide jobs or give relief. That relief should be given directly as cash transfers to recipient, rather than trying to use an inefficient vehicle inefficient in the sense you're diverting from your primary purpose into other areas to provide relief. So the conflicting objectives is one, and this is made worse by the agency problems in the public sector, which is the fact that, unlike shareholders and who have to hold management to account, citizens have to hold politicians to account. Politicians have to hold management to account. So it's two levels of uh, of
Right.
of agency costs, which makes it more difficult. So the way the Temasek model works, the critical things is non-preference and non-interference. So the state enterprise needs to play on a level playing field with the private sector, with no special preferences.
Okay.
That's the first principle that makes that model work. The second is non-interference. They need to be run completely independently from the political system.
Okay.
Now, this is a difficult combination. Singapore does it because they've got good governance behind. For Sri Lanka to do it, it's going to be very difficult, but as a temporary measure, because the most we managed to privatize was in that 89, 92 thing. I think when we did about 44, here we've got about 100 or a couple of hundred to go. So it'll take a while before you can privatize them all. But as an interim measure, as a holding point for until you are able to restructure and dispose of them, you can use a state-owned holding company.
Okay, thank you, Ravi. So once again, we invite everyone to check out the newly launched website, soe.lk, and find out and explore more information about the report as well as the scorecard methodology. Thank you.